Hello, welcome to the self learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start Unit 3 Aristotle and under heading Political Ideas of Aristotle, we are going to discuss property, family, and slavery. Aristotle's theory of property is based on his criticism of Plato's communism of property. Plato thought of property as an obstacle in the proper functioning of the state and therefore suggested communism for the guardian class. But for Aristotle, property provided psychological satisfaction by fulfilling the human instinct for possession and ownership. His chief complaint against Plato was that he failed to balance the claims of production and distribution. In Plato's communism of property, those who produce do not obtain the reward of their efforts, and those who do not produce, the rulers and the luxuries, get all comforts of life. His conclusion, therefore, is that communism of property ultimately leads to conflicts and clashes. He was of the opinion that property is necessary for one who produces it and for that matter necessary for all. Professor Maxey expresses Aristotle's voice when he says, "Man must eat, be clad, have shelter, and in order to do so must acquire property. The instinct to do so is as natural and proper as the provision nature makes in supplying wild animals and the means of satisfying the needs of sustenance and production. Property is necessary, Aristotle says himself. Wealth or property is a store of things which are necessary or useful for life in the association of a city as household. According to Aristotle, property is a part of the household and the art of acquiring property is a part of managing the household. For no man lives well or indeed live at all unless he is provided with necessaries. With regard to the ownership of property, Aristotle referred to individual ownership and individual use, which is for Aristotle the most dangerous situation. Common ownership and individual use, a situation which can begin with socialism but would end up in capitalism. It is also not acceptable. Common ownership and common use are device invariably impracticable. Individual ownership and common use are device generally possible and equally acceptable. Aristotle says property ought to be generally in and the main private but common in use. Private property is essential and therefore is justified, is what is Aristotle's thesis, but it has to be acquired through honest means. Of all the means of acquiring wealth, taking interest is the most unnatural method. Aristotle was also against amassing property. So he said to acquire too much wealth or property will be as gross an error as to make a hammer too heavy. As against Plato, Aristotle advocated the private family system. According to Aristotle, family is the primary unit of social life, which not only makes society but keeps it going. Criticizing Plato's communism of families, Aristotle writes, "For that which is common to the greatest number has the least care bestowed upon it. Everyone thinks chiefly of his own, hardly at all of the common interest, and only when he is himself concerned as an individual. For besides other considerations, everybody is more inclined to neglect something which he expects another to fulfill. As in families, many attendants are often less useful than a few. Each citizen will have 1,000 sons, which will not be his sons individually, but anybody will be equally the son of anybody, and therefore will be neglected by all alike. Aristotle believed that family is one institution where an individual is born, is nurtured, gets his identity, his name, and above all, attains intellectual development. He asserts that family is primary school of social virtue, where a child gets lessons of quality such as cooperation, love, tolerance, and sacrifice. It is not merely a primary association, but is a necessary action of society. If man is a social animal, which Aristotle insists he is, family becomes the extension of man's nature. The village, the extension of families, and the state, an extension and union of families and villages. A family, Aristotle says, consists of husband, wife, children, slaves, and property. It involves three types of relationships: that of the master and slave, martial between the husband and wife, and parental between the father and the child. The master, Aristotle held, rules the slave. The husband rules the wife. Aristotle regards women inferior to men, an incomplete male, and the father rules the son. With his belief in patriarchy, Aristotle wanted to keep women within the four walls of house, good only for household work and reproduction and nurture of species. For him, man is the head of the family. Likewise, Aristotle affirmed that man is superior to woman, wiser than the slave, and more experienced than the children. Aristotle was convinced that family is the very unit which makes up ultimately the state, from man to family, families to village, from villages to state. That is how the natural growth of the state takes place. Aristotle's views on family are quite different from Plato's, and yet Aristotle is philosophically no better than Plato. Plato regards filial affection contrary to the interest of the ideal state. Aristotle makes families the very basis of the state, for he upheld the divide between the public and private sphere. This view was later incorporated and elaborated by the liberal feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft and J.S. Mill. Aristotle justifies slavery, which in fact was the order of the day. He writes, "For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. From the hour of their birth, same are marked out for subjection, others for rule." So Foster rightly says, in fact, Aristotle justifies slavery on grounds of expediency. According to Barker, Aristotle's conception of slavery is more a justification of a necessity than a deduction from disinterested observation of facts. Maxi is more clear than numerous others in the expressing Aristotle's justification of slavery. Some persons remarks Aristotle think slavery is unjust and contrary to nature, but he is of the opinion that it is quite in accord with the laws of nature and the principle of justice. Many persons, he asserts, are intended by nature to be slaves. From the hours of their birth, they are marked for subjection. Not that they are necessarily inferior in strength of body or mind, but they are of a servile nature, and so are better off when they are ruled by other men. They lack somehow the quality of soul that distinguishes the free man and master. Consequently, it is just that they should be held as property and used as other property is used, as a means of maintaining life. Why should a person be a slave and another a master? Aristotle's answer is, "For he who can be, and therefore is, authors, and he who participates in rational principle enough to apprehend, but not to have. Such a principle is a slave by nature, and one who is one's own, and participates in the rational principles, because he had such a principle, is a master." What distinguishes a master or freeman from a slave? Aristotle makes the point. Nature would like to distinguish between the bodies of free men and slaves, making the one slave strong for servile and labor, the other freeman upright, and although useless for such services as labor, useful for political life, in the arts both of war and peace. So he concludes, "It is clear then that some men are by nature free and other slave, and that for these later slavery is both expedient and right." The argument supporting Aristotle's contention may be stated in his own words, where then there is such a difference as that between soul and body, or between man and animal, as in case of those whose business is to use their body, and who can be nothing better. The lower sort are by nature slaves, and it is better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under the rule of a master. Slavery is not only natural, it is necessary as well. It is natural, Aristotle argued, because nature does not admit equality. It is necessary, he continues, because if the master needs a slave so that he is able to enjoy a free life, the slave also needs a master so that he is able to attain the virtues of free man only in the company of free men. A slave, according to Aristotle, is a human being. He is subhuman, incomplete, and a barbarian. However, he is an animate means for action and not intended for production, for he helped in the business within the household. He belonged to the master, but Aristotle rejected inhuman treatment of slaves and advocated their emancipation as a reward for their good behavior. Aristotle had emancipated his slaves a year before his death. In contrast to Aristotle, it is argued that Plato abolished slavery in the Republic. But the actual fact is probably that Plato accepted it as given, as it was a universal institution then, and to abolish it would have been economically destructive. Aristotle, on the contrary, merely described the facts as they existed in the ancient West. However, he anticipated a time when there would be no slavery, when the spinning wheel will move of its own, when machine will replace the human worker, and this is what precisely happened. Slavery ended with the coming of the Industrial Revolution. Here we want to wind up this lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.